Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's webinar and podcast series, Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. I'm Stacey Roman, and I will be moderating this discussion today. We are pleased to have Mr. Ashley Perry, advisor to the Middle East Forum's Israel office, join us here each Wednesday at 3 p.m. Eastern to update us on all the events going on in Israel. Mr. Perry will be giving us a briefing on current Israeli affairs for 15 minutes, then open it up for questions. Should you wish to ask a question, please use the Q&A box located at the bottom of your screen to type your question. And with that, I will turn the discussion over to Mr. Ashley Perry.
Thank you very much, Stacey, and good evening from Israel. It's been quite an eventful week. We've had a lot of ups and downs. We spoke last week on the eve or the evening of Yom Ha'atzmaut, and as many of you will know, the evening afterwards, after Yom Ha'atzmaut had left us, there was the terrible terrorist attack in the ultra-Orthodox town of Elad, where three Israelis were hacked to death. Terrible, terrible scenes. Thankfully, they found the perpetrators, I think it was 2 or 3 days later, hiding in the nearby woods. And of course, today we had the death of an Al Jazeera American Palestinian journalist, which basically is causing quite a bit of outcry, as one can imagine. There's a dispute over exactly how she died. The Palestinian side mostly are saying that there's no doubt it was Israel who killed her during a security operation in Jenin. The IDF went in because of all the recent terror attacks. They've gone in to try and arrest or disband as many terrorist organizations as possible. And during an event this morning, the IDF went into Jenin, and the Al Jazeera correspondent Shirin Abu Akleh was killed. The Palestinians immediately blamed the Israelis, saying she was killed in cold blood. Israel disputes this, claiming the overall message is we don't know yet, so we're happy for a joint investigation, Israeli-Palestinian investigation. We're calling for the findings from the autopsy. We're calling to see the bullet that killed her. Apparently it was an M16, and as both sides use M16s, it's not conclusive which side killed her. Israel distributed a video showing clearly the Palestinian gunmen this morning in Jenin were just shooting randomly, sometimes around corners without looking, just shooting in different directions. But the official line is that either Israel is saying that we believe that it was a Palestinian terrorist who shot her, or we simply don't know. And there's been various, let's say, announcements on this. The Chief of Staff, Avi Kochavi, has basically said, we just don't know. Which is probably the most honest appraisal, because they simply don't at this point. They're saying it could have been them, could have been us by mistake, obviously. Israel does take great care in these type of events, and certainly would not have killed her knowingly or wittingly. But it was clear Palestinians do shoot without any particular aim sometimes, and with very little care for who's around it. Investigations could take months. The international community has not blamed Israel, especially not the West. Obviously, Qatar and Al Jazeera and the Palestinians and the Hamas, Hezbollah did, but the Americans, the Europeans and others have called for an independent investigation without specifically claiming which side that they believe, which is already a little bit of a diplomatic success for Israel, if you like. But certainly this is going to just stir flames and gained a lot of attention, so we'll see how that plays out. The real, the summer session of the Knesset opened this week, and there was a lot of political drama. Really opened the week many people thinking that this coalition was on its knees, days, weeks. I'm not saying it's not necessarily going to turn out that way, but there were those who felt that this coalition may not even see out the next couple of weeks. What basically transpired is, as we know from the last couple of weeks, Iran had suspended its involvement in the coalition. Now, during the recess, this was pretty relevant as the Knesset wasn't meeting, no votes were taking place. It was pretty irrelevant. On Monday, when it opened, it became far more relevant. And Ram, at that point, hadn't yet decided what they would do. Interestingly, on Monday, there were two votes of no confidence. As we've explained before, a vote of no confidence must be accompanied by an alternative government. And they have to lay out who's going to be prime minister and hold various positions in government. There was a feeling that, especially with Ram not showing up and some of the other defectors, that they would get at least a symbolic majority. Now, they would have had to have got 61, which they would never have got. So it was unlikely that the opposition were going to get the 61 required, because again, they still have only 60 and they're still waiting for one more, which hasn't come yet. But what was interesting is how the voting took place. The one that put former Prime Minister Netanyahu as the prime ministerial pick fell quite significantly. I think it just got 53 votes, 52 votes, I should say, which is the whole sort of right-wing religious opposition, minus, interestingly, Amichai Shikli, the original Yamina defector, but also, who else was absent from that vote, interesting, was Idit Silman, who was the newest Yamina defector and was the one who basically made the 60-60 equation. Another interesting point, especially for the Likud-led vote, was that the joint list did not vote, in fact, voted against. They didn't want to be seen as voting for Netanyahu, someone they hate even more than this coalition, to be prime minister, so they voted again. And a similar vote was put up with Moshe Gafni, the chairman of the ultra-Orthodox, the Ashkenazi ultra-Orthodox United Torah Judaism Party. Interesting, in that one, they abstained because, first of all, it's not Netanyahu, and second of all, they have a much closer relationship, the joint Arab list, with the Haredi parties. They generally have a relatively good relationship, even though their politics on security issues may be different. They found a lot of common ground over the years, so they have a good working relationship. So they did not vote against that law, but again, the coalition won both of these votes, and they certainly celebrated. Lapid and Bennett put out a video saying they were talking about this government falling within 24 hours, and here we are standing and even winning 2 votes. So it's not so much that they won, it's just the coalition lost, largely because the joint Arab list did not play ball with the opposition. Now, there's a few reasons. First of all, as I said, they do not want to be seen as supporting a Bibi-led government. The second message, probably from the joint list, was we are now significant players. We do not get told how to vote. We decide what's in our best interest. And they probably really played up this role. So that was quite significant from that early. As I said, Idit Silman, interestingly, not only did not turn up for these votes, but interestingly did turn up for the Yamina faction meeting. Every Monday, all the factions or the parties have a meeting where they discuss. Much of it is open to the media, much of it is not, where they discuss upcoming legislation, how they're going to vote, what their issues are, what their strategies are, etc., etc. And one would think, just as Amichai Shikli never attended a single Yamina faction meeting, that Idit Silman now, she's decided to move across the opposition, though still officially a Yamina MK, would not attend such a meeting. But interestingly, she did. And there was this picture of Ayelet Shaked pushing her into the faction meeting. Not really pushing her in, but leading her in. I think the directive was for her to be there, and Naftali Bennett gave quite a strong message in front of the media, but mostly directed at Silman. The threat of also declaring her, like Shikli, as a defector, official defector from the party, which means she would not be able to run with an existing party in next elections, hangs over her. And so far, she has not voted, or at least on the biggest vote on Monday, with the opposition. Interestingly enough, as we came to Wednesday, with a more significant vote was planned, which just is needed a simple majority, was a law to disperse Knesset. Now, the interesting thing about this, because it's a private member's bill, it actually has to go through four votes. The first vote just had to have a simple majority, and the opposition were quite optimistic that this would be able to vote because Ram was still suspending their Knesset role, and no one knew exactly what was going to happen. There was long late-night meetings with the Islamist party's Shura Council, which is the Council of Sages, just like some of the ultra-Orthodox parties have Council of Sages, so did they. And they were very much deciding what was going to happen. The country, to a certain extent, and certainly those who support the coalition and the opposition, were holding their breath to see which way this would go. The interesting dynamics within Ram that have been played out recently, and especially this week, is at the moment with their 4 MPs, you find 2 who would like to leave, who are finding a lot of pressure. There's personal reasons. There's Ghanaim, who is a former mayor of Sakhnin, who apparently is going to run again next year. Sakhnin is a relatively, hawkish Arab city or town, and it would look good for him not to be in a government that is supposedly, according to the Arab narrative, is doing all these terrible things to Al-Aqsa and to Palestinians, etc., etc. So he's very much pushing to move out. The leader of his side is Walid Taha, the faction the faction chairman, as opposed to the party chairman, which is Mansour Abbas. Walid Taha is probably the most hawkish, in other words, is pushing the most to leave the government. On the other side, you have Mansour Abbas and another MK, a woman MK, whose name escapes me for the moment, who very much want to stay in. And it's very interesting to see which side would have won out. Many people were saying that Walid Taha's side would have was probably going to win out, and there was a lot of nervousness at one point that that's what would happen, or at least it would be moving in that direction. In the end, it is clear that Mansour Abbas won that particular fight. Supposedly, he's given the government one more chance, and there was a press release. Interestingly, all 4 members of Knesset stood together or next to Abbas when he was saying, we are ready to go back full tilt into this government. But, and here's the interesting part, while Mansour Abbas obviously won the argument to stay in the government, partly because, as we said last week, that they are suffering in the polls and they need some achievements. I think that's the case that Mansour Abbas made to his religious leadership. The religious leadership did make a caveat, or whoever was involved in the decision. The negotiations with the rest of the government has been taken out of Mansour Abbas's hands and given to Walid Taha, which means the negotiations will be far more hawkish, will be far more difficult with the rest of the coalition parties. And also at the moment, they are not going to speak to Naftali Bennett. They are going to speak just to Yair Lapid. Ram is very unhappy that Naftali Bennett has come out quite hawkishly. They would argue on the Temple Mount, saying that it will remain under Israel sovereignty. We are not prepared to negotiate over its status, not with the Jordanians, not with anyone else. And they're very unhappy about some of the other things that have happened, some of the other Yamina members. So they basically try to take out the equation. So now we have Walid Taha, who is to a certain extent desperate to get out of the coalition. And they are not speaking to the prime minister, who is the head of the coalition. They're speaking to the number 2 of the coalition, the alternate prime minister, Yair Lapid. So at the moment, they're back in the government, but certainly Walid Taha is going to be taking a very, very hard line in negotiations. There are certain things they expect to see, some of them around Al-Aqsa, some of them around other issues, depending where you stand. Is Al-Aqsa an excuse for them, or is it a real issue? On the Israeli Arab street, as well as the Palestinian street, it is a very real issue. It just remains to be seen what they can get out of this and what other things that can be brought to the table. Interestingly, as I said, so what happened is that when it was clear that Ram were coming back to the coalition, Likud basically took their vote to disperse the Knesset off the table, because if they'd have put it on the table and they wouldn't have successfully passed this stage, if it would have been a 60-60, which was expected, then they wouldn't have been able to put this vote up for another 6 months. So they were not prepared to do that. They had hoped at the beginning of the day, or the beginning of the week certainly, that they would be able to pass that with Ram abstaining or not attending. But as soon as they understood that Ram was coming back, they basically put the motion off so as not to be embarrassed and to ensure that this particular law of dispersal of Knesset wouldn't be put off for 6 months. It also saved Nir Orbach, who is one of supposedly the likely Yamina members, possibly to move across the opposition, because if it would have passed this law to disperse the Knesset, it would have gone to his committee, where he would have been responsible for whether it moves forward quickly or slowly, and there would have been immense pressure. If this would have passed the first vote, the other votes would have needed 61, which is very important, which would have meant that they still lacked that one vote. But what the coalition were warning Ram and others, that even though, practically speaking, to get to 61, the opposition did not have it, it would mean that there would be tremendous pressure on the members of Yamina, which they think are most likely to move across, to do so. So there was a lot of pressure on Ram, and in the end, they came back to the government, and for now, it seems that they warded off a major threat. Interestingly enough, just before we go to questions, just to show how confident some in the government are, and I've been talking about that, how optimistic they are that this government is going to beat the odds and just continue and continue. Finance Minister Victor Lieberman this week started writing the budget, started presenting aspects of the budget, which is quite remarkable because, as I've said before, you need 61 to pass the budget, and there are so many different levels to the budget, and all you need is just some to fall. And as we know, at the moment, they only have 60, which means that no law will be passed by other. If everyone turns up and everyone votes the way they're supposed to, it could be that no vote will be passed. Obviously, there are votes that go this way or that way. Today, the opposition did get a vote through because Yair Golan, a member of the coalition, was giving an interview at the time. So, even just little things like that can make a law go. But you can imagine something as important as a budget, which can fail the government. Basically, unless someone comes across from the opposition, there is little to no chance that the budget will pass. But the fact that Finance Minister Victor Lieberman presented this week, perhaps one could argue it's a little bit detached from reality, but it's probably more show to try and present that everything is normal, we're moving ahead, we're a government acting as normal, as should be, as responsible, right? Starting to write a budget, presenting it, etc., etc. So, most people in the government are still trying to present it as life is normal, we can continue, even though the Knesset is going to be very difficult over the next couple of months. This government is carrying on as usual. That's the message that Lieberman was trying to give across today, and that's the message that many of them would like to show. But again, going back to the Ram situation, it will not take much. It does seem that this is a last chance that Ram is giving the government, and they will want to see something for their risk-taking, as they would see it, for sitting with the government one last time. So it remains to be seen exactly how that will play out. But certainly, the government is not tottering at the moment, but it could happen any day. It could be that at one point, the Shura Council will change its mind. It could be that the balance of power will move more towards Walid Taha, as it already has started to, away from Mansour Abbas. All of these things could bring about early elections. And if a member of Yamina or one of the other right-wing parties decides enough is enough, I'm moving across the opposition, again, that would mean that this government's days are numbered. So there are so many moving parts, and this week really just showed how fragile this government is. But at the moment, certainly it was a relatively good week for the government. With that, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you so much. The first question we have in is from an anonymous attendee. Do a majority of nonpartisan Israelis, if there are any, believe that Israel would be better off with Bibi back as prime minister, or do they think he would, or do they not think he would be better than Bennett as the leader?
The answer is hinted in the question. Who are these nonpartisan Israelis? When it comes to Bibi, there's very, very few nonpartisan You either love him or you hate him. There are some in between, but not many. It's really kind of evenly split again. If we had elections according to all the polls, neither side would get a majority. The Arab list would prevent either side from getting a majority. The Arab list, according to recent polls, have actually expanded its support at the cost of Ram to 8 seats, meaning again, neither side would. So it's very hard to find these non-partisan Israelis, especially when it comes to Netanyahu. I don't think there's too many Israelis after 13 years of power, that would probably happen everywhere, who have, no particular feelings one way or another. People have very strong opinions about Netanyahu. Most either love him or loathe him. So it all depends where you sit politically.
Thank you. And Eric asks, why is Israel having difficulties plugging the holes in the security fence that the terrorists are coming through to get to Israel?
It's a very long fence. And don't forget, the interesting thing is, for years, these holes were left purposely, one might argue, so Palestinian workers can get in and out. There is this feeling that to help the Palestinian economy, to lower the flames, to lower the tensions, you have to let in tens of thousands of Palestinian illegal workers with very little oversight come in. And that was a policy basically supported by the last government. And no one really changed it until the terror attacks happened. Now, those holes have largely been plugged up, but don't forget, it's impossible to monitor such a fence. It's a very, very long, I don't know the exact kilometer or mile length of it, but one can imagine all you need is one person with, what are they called? Cutting utensils, and you can get through. And there were, at least, maybe there still are, lots and lots of different places. And the army can't be everywhere at once. They're trying as much as possible. And certainly according to news reports, most, if not all, of the holes have been plugged up. But, again, it's a very large amount of space. And where there's a will, unfortunately, there's usually a way to get through it.
Thank you. Len Levin asks, do most average Israelis consider the right to visit the Temple Mount a very important issue? He notes that many Haredi rabbis believe that this right may violate Jewish law.
Most Israelis don't. Most Israelis don't care about it. The numbers have been growing, and there are growing numbers of even ultra-Orthodox rabbis who allow it. It's a relatively modern phenomenon that rabbis did not allow it, because the greatest sages in history did allow it. But today, there's a growing number because there are so many people going up. There is obviously resistance among some ultra-Orthodox, but if you look at the numbers going up, there's always a very large ultra-Orthodox contingent, which shows that there are quite a number of leaders in the Hasidic world and the non-Hasidic world who do allow. But for the average Israeli, the average secular or traditional Israeli, it's not really an issue. It's not something they think about. It's not something they consider doing at all. And certainly a rabbinical ban or not is not really going to affect that opinion one way or another.
Thank you. And going a little off topic, Carrie Hillebrand asks, what are the present rates of immigration from the Ukraine and from Russia? What percentage remain in Israel after obtaining Israeli passports?
I haven't really seen the numbers on that. I think there's been quite healthy aliyah from Ukraine and more quietly from Russia, obviously, in the last few months. Certainly this year is going to be, at the end of it, a bumpy year for aliyah, breaking records, not necessarily the way Israel would want it. I don't know. I mean, I can't imagine many Ukrainians who have come to Israel have gone back because the war is still raging, although obviously there are some places which are now safer than others, especially in the west part of the country. So I don't think too many have gone back, and there's all these programs to help Ukrainian students in universities, to accept them to schools. So the country is doing as much as possible to try and welcome these immigrants and make them feel, and even those who are not immigrants, to make them feel welcome. But I don't have the exact numbers. And I'm not sure if you'll ever really be able to get the numbers of someone who's taken citizenship and has left, just as there are people who made aliyah from the West and officially are Israeli citizens, but they have left and reside because you don't really have to say anything to any authorities when you decide to move abroad.
Of course, thanks. An anonymous attendee asks, can you comment on Biden's projected visit sans security to East Jerusalem? Isn't this an insult and a U.S. comment on the president's attitude towards Jerusalem? And will the president of the United States be welcomed?
Well, I mean, this is just conjecture at this point. We don't know. First of all, the official visit is obviously being planned behind the scenes, but I don't think an itinerary has been decided at the moment. I'm sure there's all sorts of ideas, and there's all sorts of advisors or advice from outside where he should go, where he shouldn't go. So I think it's a little bit too premature to talk specifics, especially something obviously is controversial about that. It depends if he does go to East Jerusalem, it depends what he's doing there. But I don't think there would ever be a situation where an Israeli government or prime minister would stop a president from visiting Israel because of a visit like that. It'd be very, very difficult for Israel, obviously, to do such a thing.
Thank you so much. And this one might need all remaining 4 minutes, but can you please give a general opinion about having Arab parties in the Knesset? Is it absurd to have outspoken enemies of the state legally deciding?
Well, first of all, Arab Israelis have been in every single Knesset from 1948 onwards. This is the first time an Arab party has been in the government, but certainly not the first time that an Arab MK has been in the government. In fact, there have been Arab ministers in the past. Ostensibly, every member of Knesset has to take an oath. Some take it more seriously than others. There are parts which obviously ultra-Orthodox parties wouldn't necessarily feel comfortable about doing, but they do it anyway. But there are lines, obviously, and if you support terrorism, if you openly act against Israel, I can't remember the exact rules, but there are rules. But so far, the only MK that I know of that was ever thrown out for breaking the rules or not allowed to run was Meir Kahane in the 1980s, who was an American immigrant who was considered to be far right, and some of his views were considered racist and controversial. And don't forget, this was under Menachem Begin. It wasn't a left-wing government at the time. So, unless they do something very, very specific, there are usually, what happens is usually just before elections, there are contests by both sides saying this party or this individual MK should not run because of their outrageous views. And there's usually a parliamentary committee. And depending on who's in power at the time, if it's the right wing, then usually they will manage to throw out a member or party, but that's usually overruled by the election commission, by the judicial commission. Again, so, supposedly they know the rules, they know what's allowed, they know what's not allowed. And all of these the current MKs are allowed to run. The ones, the party that's in the government, again, we can find all sorts of statements that were made beforehand, but certainly Mansour Abbas, the leader of the party, has made statements that were unprecedented in Israeli history from an Arab leader to say he recognizes Israel as a Jewish state, he wants to work alongside the Jewish and Zionist parties, he wants a better future, he wants world cohesion, he wants to end division, he wants to work for the betterment of his people. That's certainly a trend to be welcomed. And if that can continue, that's certainly something that's very positive for Israeli society. Having said that, yes, there are members of Knesset, some of whose comments are very problematic, have been considered by some others to be incitement to terrorism, to stand against Israel as the national homeland of the Jewish people. But again, until a judicial decision that they cannot run in elections, they will continue to run and they will continue to serve Knesset as they have done since 1948.
No, thank you so much for that answer. We have come to the close of our webinar and podcast. Ashley, thank you again for taking time to update us this week. And for our viewers and listeners, please join us Friday at 1 p.m. Eastern for a webinar with Robert Spencer discussing freedom of speech about Islam, increasing or diminishing. Thank you all for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful day.